Pain rarely announces its purpose when it enters a life. It does not explain itself. It simply arrives quietly or violently and settles into the nervous system long before the mind has language to understand it. Carl Jung believed that what wounds us earliest does not disappear with time. It reorganizes perception. And in many cases, the child who grows up carrying emotional pain does not become weaker. They become aware. The wounded child learns something most people never consciously learn: how to read a room before a word is spoken, how to sense shifts in tone, micro-expressions, silences heavy with meaning. This is not empathy as a personality trait. This is empathy as survival. When safety is uncertain, perception sharpens. The psyche adapts by becoming attentive, intuitive, hyper-receptive. Jung would say the unconscious compensates for what is missing externally by developing an inner sensitivity. This is why so many empaths do not remember choosing their depth. It chose them. As children, they learned that being emotionally attuned was safer than being loud, that noticing moods was safer than expressing needs, that understanding others was often the only way to avoid conflict, rejection, or abandonment. Over time, this adaptation solidified into an identity, the one who feels deeply, who understands without being told. Jung warned that when adaptation happens too early, it becomes invisible to the ego. The empath grows up believing this sensitivity is simply who they are, without realizing it was forged in response to pain. The wounded child did not develop perception for beauty or wisdom at first. They developed it to survive an unpredictable emotional environment. Sensitivity was armor, not decoration. And yet, here lies the paradox Jung returns to again and again. The same mechanism that protects the child can later become the seed of insight. Pain, when metabolized by the psyche, awakens perception. It pushes consciousness inward. It creates a relationship with the unconscious. The empath feels what others repress. They notice what others deny. They carry emotional information the room itself refuses to acknowledge. This is why empaths often feel older than their age, even in childhood. They were exposed too early to emotional realities that most people meet much later in life. Jung called this premature contact with the unconscious a dangerous gift. Dangerous, because without integration it leads to exhaustion, confusion, and self-abandonment. A gift, because when integrated it becomes depth, wisdom, and psychological sight. But here is the truth most people miss. Empathy without consciousness is not a virtue. It is a wound that keeps bleeding. The wounded child who becomes the empath often grows into the adult who absorbs everyone else's emotions while neglecting their own. They confuse understanding with responsibility. They confuse compassion with self-erasure. Jung would say this is the shadow side of empathy, when perception is turned outward but never inward. If this resonates, pause for a moment, not to analyze, but to notice. Because the very fact that these words land somewhere inside you may already be evidence of that heightened perception. You are not too sensitive. You were trained by experience to feel more. Before we go deeper, I want you to do something simple and honest. In the comments, write this phrase exactly as it is. My sensitivity was shaped by survival. Do not explain it, do not justify it, just write it. Sometimes naming the truth is the first act of integration. In the next part, we will explore why Jung believed the empath often carries the emotional shadow of the family, and how this burden silently shapes identity, relationships, and destiny. Carl Jung believed that no child suffers in isolation. Pain is rarely random. It is often systemic. When a family, group, or environment refuses to face its own emotional truth, that truth does not disappear. It is transferred. Someone must carry it. And very often, that someone is the most sensitive child in the room. Jung called this phenomenon psychological compensation. What is denied by the collective sinks into the unconscious and seeks expression elsewhere. In families where anger is forbidden, one child becomes anxious. In families where grief is unspoken, one child becomes melancholic. In families where love is conditional, one child becomes hyper-aware of everyone else's needs. The empath is not born fragile. They are appointed, unconsciously, as the carrier of what others refuse to feel. This is how the wounded child becomes the emotional container of the family shadow. They sense tension before arguments erupt. They absorb sadness that has no words. They intuit conflicts that are never openly discussed. Jung observed that the psyche will sacrifice one part to preserve the illusion of harmony in the whole. The empath becomes that sacrifice, not because they are weak, but because they are perceptive enough to hold what others avoid. Over time, this role solidifies. The empath grows into the listener, the mediator, the emotional translator. They become indispensable and invisible, praised for being mature, understanding, wise beyond their years, yet rarely protected. Jung warned that when a child is forced into psychological adulthood too early, they lose access to their own spontaneity. Their inner child does not disappear. It hides. This hidden child carries resentment, fatigue, and an unspoken question: who takes care of me? The tragedy is that the empath often learns to meet everyone else's emotional needs while dismissing their own as unimportant or excessive. They internalize the belief that love must be earned through understanding, patience, and silence. Jung would say this is where empathy turns into identity imprisonment. The empath confuses who they are with what they provide. They believe their value lies in how well they can hold others together. And because this pattern began in childhood, it feels natural, even virtuous. But beneath the surface, something essential is being denied: the right to be a self, not just a mirror. This is why empaths often feel an unnamed exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. It is not physical tiredness, it is psychic overload. They are carrying emotions that do not belong to them. They are loyal to roles they never consciously chose. Jung insisted that healing begins when the individual separates from the collective shadow they were assigned to carry. This does not mean becoming cold or detached. It means redirecting perception inward. The empath must learn to feel themselves with the same intensity they feel others, to notice their own boundaries, needs, anger, and grief, without guilt. Individuation, in Jungian terms, begins the moment the empath stops unconsciously serving the emotional economy of others. If this feels uncomfortably accurate, that discomfort is meaningful. Awareness always precedes liberation. Before moving forward, I want you to anchor this realization. In the comments, write this phrase: I am not responsible for emotions that are not mine. Write it once, let it sit there, not as rebellion but as recognition. In the next part, we will explore how Jung believed true empathy is reborn after the wounded child integrates their shadow, and why this transformation changes perception, relationships, and destiny itself. Jung made a clear distinction that most people never learn to see. There is a difference between raw sensitivity and integrated empathy. One is born from pain and vigilance. The other is born from consciousness. Until the wounded child turns inward and faces their own shadow, empathy remains reactive, compulsive, draining, and self-sacrificing. But when integration begins, perception changes its direction and its quality. The shadow in Jungian psychology is not evil. It is everything that was disallowed, postponed, or pushed underground in order to survive. For the empath, the shadow often contains anger they were never allowed to express, needs they learned to minimize, boundaries they were punished for asserting. These parts do not vanish. They wait, and they demand recognition. This is why so many empaths feel an inner tension they cannot explain. They sense others clearly, yet feel disconnected from themselves. Jung warned that perception aimed only outward leads to alienation from the self. The empath becomes an antenna, not a center. Healing begins when perception turns around and faces what was buried. Integration is not gentle at first. When the empath begins to acknowledge their shadow, guilt often rises. Saying no feels dangerous. Choosing oneself feels selfish. Expressing anger feels like betrayal. Jung would say this resistance proves the shadow is real and necessary. What frightens the ego most is often what restores balance. As the empath integrates their shadow, something subtle but profound occurs. Sensitivity stabilizes. They no longer absorb every emotion in the room. They observe it. They no longer confuse compassion with compliance. They develop boundaries that do not harden the heart, but protect it. Empathy shifts from a reflex to a choice. This is the moment pain completes its transformation. The wounded child does not disappear. They are reclaimed. Their perception is no longer driven by fear of abandonment or chaos. It is guided by clarity. Jung believed that when the unconscious is made conscious, it stops controlling behavior from the shadows. The empath no longer reacts. They respond. With this shift, perception deepens. The empath begins to see patterns instead of absorbing moods, motivations instead of emotional noise, truth instead of tension. This is what Jung meant by psychological sight. Not intuition born of anxiety, but insight born of integration. Relationships change at this stage. Some fall away, others deepen. The empath can now stand in connection without dissolving into it. They no longer need to fix, save, or carry others to feel worthy. Their presence alone becomes stabilizing. This is integrated empathy, quiet, grounded, and powerful. If you are feeling a strange mix of relief and fear right now, that is not accidental. It often means something inside you recognizes this path. Integration always costs something, old roles, old loyalties, old identities, but it gives something rarer in return, inner authority. Before we move to the final part, anchor this shift. In the comments, write this phrase: my empathy becomes power when I choose myself. Do not rush past it. Let it mark a transition. In the next and final part, we will explore how Jung believed integrated empaths often become seers, individuals who perceive truth without being consumed by it, and why this is the final alchemy of early pain. Carl Jung believed that when early pain is fully integrated, it does not vanish. It transfigures. What once sharpened perception out of fear now sharpens it out of clarity. This is the final movement in the inner journey. The empath no longer lives as a wound that reacts to the world, but as a consciousness that sees it. Jung often spoke of the seer, not as a mystic detached from reality, but as an individual who can look directly at psychological truth without flinching. The seer is born when perception is no longer hijacked by unresolved emotion. The empath, who has integrated their shadow, does not need to escape intensity. They can remain present within it. They do not absorb chaos. They recognize it. This is why truly integrated empaths are often misunderstood. They are calm where others panic, silent where others perform, unimpressed by emotional manipulation. Their sensitivity is no longer visible as fragility, but as discernment. Jung would say they have withdrawn projections and reclaimed psychic energy. They see clearly because they are no longer entangled. Early pain created the conditions for this transformation, but it did not complete it. Conscious work did. Reflection, boundary setting, shadow integration, individuation. The wounded child did not become the seer automatically. They became the candidate. And only through inner confrontation did perception mature into wisdom. At this stage, empathy no longer seeks validation. The seer does not need to be understood by everyone. They have made peace with solitude, not as isolation, but as inner alignment. Jung believed that individuation inevitably separates the individual from the collective illusion, and then returns them to it, not as a servant, but as a witness. This is the final paradox. The empath who once carried everyone's emotions now stands emotionally sovereign. They can love without losing themselves, help without self-erasure, see without absorbing. Their presence alone invites honesty, not because they demand it, but because they embody it. If you recognize yourself here, understand this. You were never too much. You were early. Your nervous system learned truths before your environment could hold them. Pain awakened perception, but consciousness refined it. Jung wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For the empath, this means no longer confusing pain with identity. The wound was the doorway, not the destination. Before you leave, anchor this understanding with one final act of recognition. In the comments, write this phrase: I no longer live as my wound, I see through it. Write it once. Let it stand as a quiet declaration. If this journey resonated with you, stay close. These ideas deepen when revisited, not quickly, but honestly.